Stig of the Dump by Clive King. Read by Tony Robinson. If you went too near the edge of the chalk pit, the ground would give way. Barney had been told this often enough. Everybody had told him. His grandmother, every time he came to stay with her. His sister, every time she wasn't telling him something else. Barney had a feeling that it was probably true about the ground giving way, but there was a difference between being told and seeing it happen. And today was one of those grey days when there was nothing to do, nothing to play, and nowhere to go, except to the chalk pit. The dump. Barney got through the rickety fence and went to the edge of the pit. This had been the side of a hill once. Men had come to dig away chalk and left this huge hole in the earth. He thought of all the sticks of chalk they must have made, and all the blackboards in all the schools they must have written on. They must have dug and dug for hundreds of years. And then they got tired of digging, or somebody had told them to stop before they dug away all the hill. And now they didn't know what to do with this empty hole, and anything people didn't want, they threw into the bottom of the pit. He crawled through the rough grass and peered over. The sides of the pit were white chalk, with lines of flint poking out like bones in places. At the top was crumbly brown earth, and the roots of the trees that grew on the edge twined in the air and grew back into the earth. Some of the trees hung over the edge, holding on desperately by a few roots. The earth and chalk had fallen away beneath them, and one day they too would fall to the bottom of the pit. Strings of ivy and the creeper called Old Man's Beard hung in the air. Far below was the bottom of the pit, the dump. Barney could see strange bits of wreckage among the moss and elder bushes and nettles. Was that the steering wheel of a ship? The tail of an aeroplane? There was a real bicycle. Barney felt sure he could make it go if only he could get at it. They didn't let him have a bicycle. Barney wished he was at the bottom of the pit. Barney felt his head going down and his feet going up. There was a rattle of falling earth beneath him. Then he was falling, still clutching the clump of grass that was falling with him. "This is what it's like when the ground gives way," thought Barney. Then he crashed through some creepers and ivy and branches and landed on a bank of moss. His thoughts did those funny things they do when you bump your head and you suddenly find yourself thinking about what you had for dinner last Tuesday, all mixed up with 7 times 6. Barney lay with his eyes shut, waiting for his thoughts to stop being mixed up. Then he opened them. He was lying in a kind of shelter. Looking up, he could see a roof made of elder branches, a rotten old carpet, and rusty old sheets of iron. There was a big hole through which he must have fallen. He could see the white walls of the cliff, the trees and creepers at the top, and the sky with clouds passing over it. Barney decided he wasn't dead. He didn't even seem to be very much hurt. He looked around him. It seemed to be partly a cave dug into the chalk, partly a shelter built out over the mouth of the cave. Woodlice and earwigs dropped from the roof where he'd broken through it. His legs wouldn't move. "Perhaps I've broken them," Barney thought. He looked and found they were all tangled up with creeper. He kicked his legs to get them free. "I suppose I got tangled up when I fell," he thought. "Except I would have broken my neck if I hadn't." He lay quiet and looked around the cave again. Now that his eyes were used to it, He could see further into the dark part of the cave. There was somebody there, or something. Something or somebody had a lot of shaggy black hair and 2 bright black eyes. "Hello," said Barney. Something said nothing. "I fell down the cliff," said Barney. Somebody grunted. "My name's Barney." Something made a noise that sounded like Stig. "Do you think you could help me undo my feet, Mr. Stig?" asked Barney politely. "I've got a pocket knife," he added. He had in his pocket a knife he'd found among the wood shavings on the floor of Grandfather's workshop. It was quite good, except that one blade had come off and the other one was broken in half. "Good thing I put it in my pocket," he thought. He wriggled so he could reach the knife and managed to open the rusty half-blade. He found it was difficult to cut creepers with a blunt knife when your feet are tied above your head. The thing sitting in the corner moved towards Barney into the light. It was somebody after all. "Funny way to dress, though," he thought. "Rabbit skins round the middle and no shoes or socks." "Oh, Puff," said Barney. "I can't reach my feet. You do it, Stig." He handed the knife to Stig. Stig turned it over with his strong, hairy hands and tested the edge with a thumb. Then he squatted on the ground and picked up a broken stone. "He's going to sharpen the knife," thought Barney. But no. Using the hard knife to chip with, Stig was carefully flaking tiny splinters off the edge of the flint until he had a thin, sharp blade. Then he sprang up and with 2 slashes cut through the creeper that tied Barney's feet. Barney sat up. "Golly, you are clever!" Stig grinned. Then he went to the back of the cave and hid the broken knife under a pile of rubbish. "My knife!" protested Barney, but Stig took no notice. Barney got up and went into the dark part of the cave. He'd never seen anything like the collection of bits and pieces that this Stig creature had lying about his den. There were stones and bones, fossils and bottles, skins and tins, stacks of sticks and hanks of string. There were motor car tyres and hats from old scarecrows, nuts and bolts and baubles from brass bedsteads. There was a coal scuttle full of dead electric light bulbs and a basin with rusty screws and nails in it. There was a pile of bracken and newspapers that looked as if it were used for a bed. The place looked as if it had never been given a tidy up. "I wish I lived here," said Barney. Stig seemed to understand that Barney was approving of his home, and his face lit up. He began pointing out some of the things he seemed particularly proud of. First, the plumbing. Where the water dripped through a crack in the roof of the cave, he'd wedged the mudguard of a bicycle. The water ran along this, through the tube of a vacuum cleaner, and into a big can. It was dark in the back of the cave. Stig went to the front, where the ashes of a fire were smoking faintly, blew on them, picked up a book that lay beside his bed, tore out a page and rolled it up, lit it at the fire, and carried it to a lamp set in a niche in the wall. As it flared up, Barney could see it was in fact an old teapot filled with some kind of oil and with a bootlace hanging out of it for a wick. In the light of the lamp, Stig went to the very back of the cave and began to thump the wall and point and explain something in his strange grunting language. Barney didn't understand a word, but he recognized the tone of voice, like when grown-ups go on about, "I'm thinking of tearing this down and building on here and having this done up." Stig had been digging into the wall, enlarging his cave. There was a bit of an old bed he'd been using as a pick, and a baby's bath full of loose chalk to be carried away. Then Stig reached up to a bunch of turnips hanging from a poker stuck in the wall. He handed Barney a turnip, took one for himself, and began to eat it. Barney sat down on a bundle of old magazines and munched. The turnip was fresh, and it tasted better to him than the spinach he'd hidden under his spoon at dinner time. Barney looked at Stig. Funny person to find living next door to you, he thought. Stig didn't seem much bigger than himself, but he looked very strong, and his hands looked cleverer than his face. But how old was he? 10, 20, 100, 1,000? You been here long? Asked Barney. Stig grinned again. Long, he said. Long, long, long. But it sounded more like an echo than an answer to his question. I'm staying at my grandmother's house, said Barney. I better go now. Thank you for having me. Can I have my knife back, please? Stig looked blank. Knife? Said Barney, and made cutting movements with his hand. Stig picked up the worked flint and gave it to Barney. Oh, can I have that? Exclaimed Barney. Thank you. He looked at the stone, hard and shiny, almost like a diamond, and much more useful. Then he put it in his pocket, said goodbye again, and went out of the low door of the shelter. There was a way out at the other end of the pit, and when he got back to the house, his grandmother and Sister Lou were just coming in from feeding the hens. What have you been doing? His grandmother asked. Well, I fell and bumped my head. Poor old Barney, said Lou, and laughed. But it was all right, Barney went on, because I met Stig. Who's Stig? A sort of boy. He wears rabbit skins and lives in a cave. He gets his water through a vacuum cleaner and puts chalk in his bath. He's my friend. Good gracious, exclaimed his grandmother. What funny friends you have, dear. He means he's been playing cavemen, Lou exclaimed helpfully. Stig's just a pretend friend, isn't he, Barney? No, he's really true. Of course he's true, his grandmother smiled. Now, Lou, don't tease. That night, Barney kept the flint under his pillow and thought of Stig out there in the pit, sleeping on his bed of bracken and old newspapers. He wished he lived all the time at Granny's house so that he could get to know Stig. He had to go back the day after tomorrow. Never mind, he'd visit Stig in the morning. It was a fine autumn morning, and Barney pushed his breakfast down as fast as he could manage. What do you want to do today? His grandmother asked. I have to go into Sevenoaks. Do you want to come? No, thank you, Granny, he said. I just want to mess about with Stig. Oh, I see, Granny smiled. Well, Mrs. Pratt will be here all the morning, so if you like, you can stay with her. And with Stig, of course. Lou said she'd like to go into the town. Barney's feet made dark prints in the dew as he headed across the lawn. Then he stopped. Suppose he didn't find Stig after all. The sun was bright. A robin puffed its breast on a rose tree and squeaked at him. Barney suddenly wasn't sure that he believed in Stig himself. It wasn't a Stiggish day like yesterday when he'd fallen down the pit. That was real enough. He'd fallen and bumped his head. And then what? Funny things did happen when you bumped your head. Perhaps you only saw Stig when you fell and bumped your head. He didn't want to go to the chalk pit and find nothing. He stood with his hands in his pockets in the middle of the lawn, his fingers playing with something hard in the left-hand pocket of his jeans. He pulled out the thing he had in his hand. Of course! The flint! He'd seen Stig make it. There was no mistake about that. Of course Stig was real. He set off again at a run, climbed the fence into the paddock, and waded through the long, wet grass the other side. In the middle of the paddock, he found himself stopping again. He'd seen pictures of chipped flints in books and real ones in museums. They were made thousands of years ago by rough people who weren't alive any longer. People found them and put them in cases with notices on them. Suppose he hadn't imagined Stig. Was he the sort of person who liked people coming to play? Well, he told himself, all he really wanted to do was look at the place where he'd fallen over yesterday, have another look at the dump. There was that bicycle, anyway. Feeling bolder, He went on to the edge of the pit, making sure this time that he kept near a big tree that seemed to be well anchored to the side, and peeped over. He could see the patch of raw earth and white chalk where the ground had given way under him, the dangling creepers lower down, and a scatter of broken chalk at the bottom. He craned over to see the hole he'd made in the roof of the den. There was no hole, not a sign of a hole, of a roof, of a den, of a Stig. He listened. A blackbird was making a noise much too big for itself, but apart from that, the pit was silent and empty. Barney walked away, thinking hard. He remembered crashing through a sort of roof and leaving a big gaping hole, and yet there wasn't a hole. Suddenly the answer came to him like getting a sum right. If there wasn't a hole, it was because somebody had mended it. Stig wasn't the sort of person to leave a large hole in his roof for long, not his friend Stig. All at once, everything fitted together. Yesterday's adventure on that Stiggish sort of afternoon, the bump on his head, the flint, and this bright autumn morning when he was going to visit his friend Stig. He was quite clear now what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. He set off running back to the garden. Presents for Stig. When you visited people this time of year, you always brought them something from the garden. Tomatoes you couldn't bottle, or apples you hadn't room to store. He looked round the big apple tree for windfalls. There were some big ones, difficult to manage without a basket, but he stuffed them into his shirt. What else? He saw a line of carrots. He was allowed to pull up carrots, they were good for his teeth, so he heaved up a few. Then he had an idea and ran to the tool shed where he found a ball of garden string. Back he ran again, across the garden, over the fence, across the paddock, over into the copse, and through the brambles to the edge of the pit. He sat comfortably on the trunk of the tree that curved out over the pit like the neck of a camel, and looked carefully again at what he could see. There was the broken edge of the cliff, there were the trailing creepers, there at the bottom were the scattered lumps of chalk that had come down with him. And now that he was really looking, he could see a piece of new linoleum. Well, not new, nothing in the dump was new, but it looked as if it had been put there not long ago because it wasn't covered with moss, and he could see a faint path in the bottom of the pit that led to the front of the den. He found the end of the ball of string and tied the bunch of carrots to it. Then he began to pay out the string with the carrots dangling on the end towards the bottom of the pit. At last, with a few feet in hand, the carrots were swinging on a level with Stig's front door. Barney had to get the carrots swinging to and fro until they were actually knocking at the door like 5 pink fingers. "Stig," he called. "Morning, Stig. I'm knocking at your front door." And suddenly out from the stack of branches appeared the tousled head of Stig, wagging to and fro, following the swinging carrots like a cat watching a pendulum. Barney nearly fell off the tree with laughing. "Hello, Stig," he called. "Good morning. How are you?" Stig looked up, and for a moment Barney felt quite frightened at the ferocious scowl on his face. Should he have played a trick on Stig? Perhaps he didn't have what the grown-ups called a sense of humour. But when Stig made out who it was sitting above him, his big white teeth showed in a broad grin. He waved both his arms over his head. "Have a carrot, Stig," called Barney. "To eat," he added. "Good for your teeth," he said, making biting movements. Stig leapt at the carrots, caught them, looked at them closely, smelt them, then put one in his mouth and crunched it. He looked up at Barney, smiling with his mouth full to show that he liked his present, then made signs which clearly meant that Barney was to come down. "Well, I'm not going to jump this time," said Barney. "I'm going round," he said, making circling movements with his arms. He got off his perch and walked the long way round the top of the pit to the shallow end where he'd got out the night before. The dump looked quite different, more cheerful, with the sunlight pouring down through the golden autumn leaves, and the ash and sycamore seeds twiddling down from the trees on top. But the tail of the aeroplane was only part of a farm machine, and the ship's helm was a broken cartwheel. There was the bicycle too. Just a rusty frame with bits of brake hanging onto it. Never mind. He'd found something much more interesting. A real live Stig, and he was going to visit him. That's if he could find his way among the giant nettles. Suddenly there was Stig coming to meet him, straight through a nettle patch as if stings meant nothing to him. Barney stopped. What now? Shake hands? Rub noses? No, perhaps not. He remembered the apples, took one out and held it towards Stig. "I hope you liked the carrot, Stig," said Barney. "Have an apple." Stig took the apple quite politely between finger and thumb, not between his teeth as Barney somehow expected him to, and sniffed it. Barney took out another apple for himself and bit into it. "Good," he said. "Delicious." Stig took a bite, seemed to like it, smiled, and they both started walking towards the den, munching. Stig just blundered through the nettles, and as far as Barney could see, they stung him as they did other people, but he just didn't care. Barney himself got stung once or twice, but decided not to make a fuss about it. Stigs don't mind stings, he thought, so he'd better not. Barney noticed several dumps of new white chalk near the path, and remembered the new tunnelling he'd seen yesterday and the baby's bath full of chalk. "Been digging, Stig?" he asked, pointing. Stig grinned and nodded. It was gloomy and overhung at Stig's end of the pit, even on this bright day, and the den itself, now that the hole in the roof was mended, was even darker. The teapot lamp was flickering and throwing a dim light on the place where Stig had been digging, but it wasn't very cheerful. Come to think of it, thought Barney, rabbits and things that live in holes don't have any light at all. Not much fun for them with no windows. Couldn't he find some windows for Stig? What made it worse was that Stig had started a small fire in the den part. The smoke was filling the den, and there was no way out for it except to trickle through the gaps in the roof. It made Barney's eyes water. The place could do with a chimney as well as windows. He began to get used to the darkness. He could see that the tunnel at the back of the cave went further back into the chalk than he'd noticed. "Can I help you dig, Stig?" he asked. He went to the end of the tunnel and picked up the bit of bedstead and began to attack the wall of chalk. It wasn't as easy as he'd expected. The chalk in the inside of the hill here was firm, not crumbly as it was on the outside where the rain got at it. Barney's bashes with the awkward piece of metal only broke off smallish chips, and he was soon puffed. Stig took the digger from his hands and showed him how to dig out a hollow at the bottom of the chalk wall, then knock down large chunks, which came away easily because they weren't held up underneath. There was soon a pile of loose chalk, and Barney picked it up with his hands and put it in the small tin bath. Stig helped him, and between them they lugged the load out of the den and dumped it. But Barney noticed that Stig took care to put it some way from his door. He supposed that piles of new white chalk would let people know that something was going on. Stig let him dig next time, and he soon got the hang of it. Now and then they'd come to a great flint embedded in the chalk, and they'd have to chip round it and loosen it like a tooth, until at last it came free, usually bringing down a lot of chalk with it. They worked on happily for quite a time, taking it in turns to dig and load, and now and then they'd stop for a break and take a drink of water from the tin or eat a refreshing apple. Barney's jeans were white with chalk dust, and his hair and nails were full of it. He suddenly wondered what his grandmother would say. Then he suddenly wondered what time it was. In spite of the apples, his tummy was telling him that it might be lunchtime. "You haven't got a clothes brush, have you, Stig?" he asked. Stig looked blank. Barney's eye fell on Stig's water pipe. Somebody had thrown away a vacuum cleaner, so there must be one of the brush things somewhere. Sure enough, he spied one, fixed as a sort of tea-piece on the end of a long, thin pole that was helping to hold the roof up. He thought the roof might hold itself up for a bit while he got the worst of the chalk dust off with the vacuum cleaner end. and it did.
"You're lucky, Stig," said Barney. "Nobody asks you how you got in such a mess. I've got to go now. Pity I can't ask you to lunch, but..."
But really, he thought, nobody else even believes in him yet.
"I'll be back this afternoon. Thanks for letting me help you. Goodbye."
Grandmother and Lou were late getting back from the town, so he had time to get the chalk out of his nails and hair, and they were too full of talk about how they'd spent their morning to question him much about what he'd been doing. Over the stewed apples, he was able to say quietly,
"Granny, have you got any things you don't want?"
"What sort of things, dear? Chilblains? Grandchildren?"
"No, Granny. Things like windows and chimneys."
Grandmother said that really she couldn't think of anything like windows and chimneys, except windows and chimneys, and she thought the house had only just enough of these to go round. And Lou just laughed and said,
"Really, Barney?"
Then Grandmother said that it did remind her there were some tins and jam jars she'd meant to put out for the dustbin man, and perhaps Barney would be a dear and carry them to the gate. There were more jam jars than Barney had thought possible, and quite a lot of useful tins, the sort with lids. Barney looked at them. Why shouldn't Stig have them? He remembered a big wooden box which Grandfather had helped him fix wheels onto, so that he and Lou could use it as a cart. He found it among the firewood, but still with its 4 wheels more or less straight, and the piece of rope on the front to pull it with. He loaded it with jam jars and tins, and found it quite a weight when he set off across the paddock with it. By the time Barney had got his load to the edge of the pit, he was quite tired, but there was still the problem of getting them to the bottom. He sat on the camel's neck tree trunk. The string was still there. It was the thick brown sort, and he thought it would be strong enough for a few jam jars. He called to Stig, and after a time, Stig came out backwards dragging a load of chalk.
"I've got some things for you, Stig,"
Barney called. He pulled up the string and took the end to the pile of jam jars. About 8 of them were packed in a cardboard box. He tied the string round the box, took it carefully along the tree trunk, and started to lower it. This wasn't nearly as easy as the carrots. The box swung wildly, and he hardly dared to look down and see what was happening. He hoped Stig wouldn't get a jam jar on his head. The box was hanging by one corner when it reached the ground, but instead of untying it, Stig disappeared into his den.
"Hey, Stig! Undo it!"
Barney called.
"There's more to come!"
Stig came out again, holding what was left of a large, broad-brimmed lady's straw hat, with ribbons to tie it under the chin. He untied the string from the box and tied it to the ribbons. It made a useful-looking cargo sling.
"Jolly good idea, Stig!"
Barney shouted. Stig's got brains, he thought. After that, it was quite easy. He hauled up the hat, filled it with jam jars, lowered it down, waited for Stig to unload, hauled it up again, and so on. When he'd finished the jam jars, he started on the tins, which were much lighter. And when he'd lowered all the tins, he looked at the truck. Could he send the truck down the same way? If he didn't, he'd have to trundle it all the way round the top and along the bottom of the pit. He wound the string a few times round the branch stump, leaving enough loose to reach the truck on the cliff top, humped himself along the tree trunk, tied the string to a wheel of the truck, moved back along the trunk and pulled the truck towards him by the string. The truck lurched over the edge of the cliff, swung wildly outwards on the string, which ran out so fast that he couldn't stop it, until a tangle in the string made it stop with a jerk. The string broke, and the truck was falling through the air. Barney held on for dear life to the tree, with his face against the mossy bark, and shut his eyes. He felt weak and dizzy. At last he allowed himself to look down. He couldn't see the truck at first.
Then he saw that it had swung out to land in the branches of an elder tree and was hanging there quite happily. "I've sent the truck down," he called to Stig. "It may come in useful." He was still feeling what his grandmother used to call hot and cold all over, but he carefully inched himself off the tree and onto firm ground and set off round and down to the pit. By the time he got to the den, Stig had untangled the truck from the tree and was squatting, looking at it, and at the tins and jam jars. And then Barney wondered what they were going to do with them. "These are jam jars, Stig," he explained. "Jam and marmalade come in them, and you can use them for keeping stuff in them, rice and coffee and things like that." But did Stig want to keep rice and coffee in his den? "And these are tins. They're empty, of course, but you get all sorts of things in tins, peaches and baked beans. You have to open them with an opener like this." He took out of his pocket a tin opener which he usually carried about with him. It was the sort with a butterfly handle which you had to turn. Just to show, he fitted it on the bottom of one of the empty tins and twisted the handle. The opener crept round the edge of the tin, the blade ploughed into the metal at the bottom, and soon the shiny round disc of metal came loose. Stig was fascinated. He looked at the flat round piece of tin which had been the bottom. He looked at the empty tube, which was all that was left of the rest of it, and he took the tin opener from Barney and turned the handle. But he couldn't make it out. "It's quite easy, Stig." And Barney took another tin, fitted the opener on the bottom, and showed him how to work it. And there was another round plate and another tin tube. Then Stig had to have a go, and they started on a third. One of the tins had been rather flattened, but it gave Barney an idea for how it might be used. He took it, left Stig with the others, and towed the truck into the den and along to the place where Stig had been digging at the chalk. There was quite a lot of loose rubble lying about there, and Barney set to work to shovel it into the truck with the flattened tin. It was certainly better than using his hands, though it wasn't quite the right sort of shovel shape yet. He hammered at it with an unbroken flintstone and made it into quite a handy scoop, like the sort the village grocer used for shovelling sugar into little paper bags. He toiled away until the truck was heaped full. It held much more chalk than the tin bath, and because of its wheels, he could pull it away quite easily. "Look, Stig," he said as he went past where Stig was sitting. "Look at all the chalk I've loaded." But Stig seemed too busy to notice. Barney wheeled the truck along to the place where they were now dumping the chalk and tipped out his load. Then he ran back to the den, with the truck bouncing along empty behind him. When he got back, Stig was sitting there surrounded by round plates of tin and empty tubes, and just in the act of taking the bottom out of the last tin. "Stig, what are you doing?" exclaimed Barney. "You've spoiled all the tins now. You can't keep things in tins with no bottoms." He was really quite annoyed. What was the use of a lot of tin tubes with no ends? Stig sat there playing with them. He seemed to have the idea of fitting one inside the other, but that wouldn't work because they were all exactly the same size. However, one of them that had got a bit pinched did fit into another, which seemed to please him a lot. Barney thought it was a bit childish of Stig to sit there playing like a baby with plastic bricks when there was all that work to be done, but Stig went on seriously worrying over the problem of fitting them together. He found that by pinching together the end of a tin, he could make it fit into the next one. And soon he had 4 or 5 fitted together like a length of stovepipe. Stovepipe! Barney knew there was something Stig needed badly. "You are clever, Stig," he said. "You've made a chimney." Stig looked blank. He didn't know he needed a chimney. He didn't know what a chimney was. Certainly he'd made one, but if it hadn't been for Barney, he wouldn't have known. Working together, they fitted all the tins one into the other until they had a pipe that was taller than either of them. With Barney directing, they carried it into the smoky den, where it was too long to stand upright. "Now, all we've got to do is poke it through the roof," said Barney. Stig looked doubtfully at him. but together they managed quite easily to push it through a crack between the piece of linoleum and a sheet of corrugated iron. But now what? They couldn't just leave it hanging above the fire. "I know," exclaimed Barney. "The bath!" He left Stig patiently holding the chimney and went and fetched the tin bath. What luck! It had a rusty hole in the bottom, which only needed a little work with the boot scraper to make it big enough to fit the chimney through. Stig was dimly beginning to see what Barney was trying to do. Together they built up a fireplace of chalk blocks and big flints, rested the bath upside down on top, and there was mantelpiece and chimney, with the flue leading from the hole in the upturned bath through the roof and into the open air. Barney lit the fire, which Stig had laid as they built the fireplace, and threw some additional scraps of paper and twigs onto it. Once the smoke had learnt its way, it went roaring up the pipe. They rushed outside, and there it was, coming out of what looked like a proper chimney pot sticking through the roof. Stig watched fascinated. "There you are, Stig," said Barney. "Now you've got a proper fireplace, people can come and visit you without getting their eyes full of smoke." Actually, Stig didn't seem to care very much about having the place full of smoke, but he was as pleased with his fireplace as if it had been a new toy, and kept on putting twigs and leaves on the fire so that he could go out and see the smoke coming out the other end. And Barney was so proud of his invention that he looked round for something else to invent. He saw the stack of jam jars. What had he brought those for? It would be too dull just to use them to keep food in. Stig's den wasn't that sort of place. He had to think of a new way of using jam jars. What had he thought Stig's house needed most? A chimney. He'd got that now. A chimney. And yes, a window. Well, windows were made of glass, and so were jam jars. Yes, but the shape. Doors were made of wood, and so were clothes pegs. Ships were made of steel, and so were tin openers. But you can't make a ship out of tin openers or a door out of clothes pegs. The shape's wrong. You couldn't hammer glass flat, could you? He picked up the boot scraper. No, of course not. Stig had stacked the jars on top of each other, lying on their sides. They made a sort of wall of glass like that, but they rolled about, and of course there were gaps between the jars. Barney looked at one side of the den, the darkest side, which really needed windows. It was built of wooden boxes from the dump, bottoms outward, open tops inward. He took the digging tool and knocked the bottom out of one. There was now an open square where the daylight came in, but so did the wind, and Stig didn't seem at all pleased at sitting in a draught. Stigs like to be snug, thought Barney. He carried the jars in and stacked them in the frame of the box. They fitted quite well. The light came in, but the draught came in too. Stig got up and looked at the gaps between the jars, grunted, and went out of the den. Barney followed him, wondering. Stig led the way along the bottom of the cliff to where there'd lately been a landslide, and quite a large chunk of cliff top had come down in one piece. Between the topsoil and the chalk there was a layer of red clay, good damp squidgy stuff you could make model animals with. Stig began to dig out lumps of clay with his fingers, and Barney found another good clay mine and did the same. They got as much as they could carry and took it back to the den, and from the outside Stig set to work to fill in the gaps between the jam jars. They had to make 2 more journeys before all the jars were firmly bedded in clay, and then Barney carefully wiped the smears off the bottoms of the jars with a rag. Then they stood and admired their window. They even made faces at each other, one standing inside and the other outside, because you could almost see through it. It certainly let the light in, even though it was late in the afternoon and there wasn't much light to let in. "Well, well," said Barney, "that's that." It was a thing he had often heard his grandfather say when he'd finished a job. He was tired after all the inventing he'd done. He went to sit down, and then he saw all the round plates of tin that Stig had cut out lying around on the floor. He gathered them up. There must be a use for these too. He went back to the window and found that the discs fitted exactly over the ends of the jars if he pressed them into the soft clay. There were just enough to go round. "There you are, Stig," he said. "Like on a ship, to shut the portholes if you don't want people to look in, or to shut the dark out." There was a feeling in the evening air that darkness was coming, and that it would be snug to sit by the new fireplace and watch the fire going up the chimney. But Barney suddenly remembered something and stood up with his mouth open. "Stig," he said, "I've got to go home, all the way home, I mean. I probably won't be staying with Granny till Christmas." Stig looked at him. "Stig," said Barney, "when I come back again, you will still be here, won't you?" Stig didn't answer, but he went to a little niche in the chalk wall, poked about among some things there, and brought back something which he gave to Barney. He looked at it. It was a little chipped flint, perfectly shaped like a flat Christmas tree, and very sharp. "An arrowhead," Barney gasped. "For me? Oh, thank you, Stig. I really must go now. See you at Christmas. You will be here at Christmas, won't you, Stig? Goodbye!" And he ran off. As he made his way along the bottom of the pit, he felt he knew the way there better than anywhere else in the world, and he felt that Stig's house was as much his home as anywhere else. After all, it was like drawing pictures. Once you've put a chimney and a window on a house, you've really made a house. End of Side 1. Side 2. Christmas was over at Grandmother's house. The last turkey bone had been picked, the last thimble found in the pudding. They'd even got a good way round the Christmas cake. Barney lay in bed in the grey morning light. The air felt icy to the end of his nose. He was looking at the thick black beam in the wall that grew out of the floor right up to the ceiling. It had been part of a ship before it was part of the house, Grandfather said. It had deep holes cut out of it where other bits of timber had fitted into it. What was that hidden in one of the holes? Stig's flint, left there since last time he'd come to stay. He hadn't even thought about Stig all over Christmas. He got out of bed and looked out of the window. There was white frost on the grass. "I wonder what it's like living in a cave these days," thought Barney. "Poor Stig, he must be cold." After breakfast, Barney went off to the pit. There was no sign of life in the shelter, though he noticed the ashes of a small dead fire. But at the back of the cave was a kind of nest made of bracken and dead grass and newspaper. He thought he heard breathing sounds coming out of it. "Stig!" Barney called. Nothing happened. "I wonder if he's like a dormouse," he thought, "and goes to sleep all the winter." He called again. "Stig! Are you there?" There was a rustle in the nest, and a mop of black hair poked up out of it. His eyes still screwed up and his mouth shut. Stig took a deep breath. Then he sneezed. It was a sneeze like a cannon going off. "You've got a cold, Stig. No wonder when you live in this damp place you need a good fire." Barney looked around. There didn't seem to be any wood to burn. Stig's heavy flint axe was leaning against the wall, and Barney picked it up, but he saw that the edge was crumbled and blunt. "You'll have to sharpen this." Stig crawled out of his nest, blinking stupidly. He didn't take the axe as Barney held it out to him. "All right, I'll do it then," said Barney. He sat down with the axe between his knees and picked up a heavy iron bolt and tried to remember how he'd seen Stig chip the flint. But it was painful holding the cold flint and the cold iron, and his fingers wouldn't do what he wanted. "Oh, never mind," said Barney. "Come on, we've got to get some wood." He stood up with the axe and went out of the shelter. Stig followed, half frozen and silent. They climbed up out of the pit and looked around the copse for wood to cut. Barney chose a fairly thin thorn tree and set to work on it. The axe swung, the tree shook, the flint bounced off the tough bark, but he didn't seem to be getting anywhere. Stig just squatted miserably on a bank. "Here, you have a go," puffed Barney. "My grandfather always says wood warms you twice, once when you cut it and once when you burn it." He handed the axe to Stig, but Stig only looked at it sadly and shook his head. Suddenly Barney had an idea. "Wait here, Stig, I won't be long." Barney ran off towards the house. He went to the shed at the back and got his grandfather's big steel axe and the long sharp cross-cut saw and a coil of rope. He made off again down the field to the copse. "Here you are, Stig," he called as he came up to Stig. The sight of the shining steel axe worked like medicine on Stig. He uncurled himself and picked up the axe by its long handle. He tried its sharp edge with his thumb. He weighed it in his hands and swung it. His eyes lit up, and he looked around for something to use his new weapon on. Standing among the saplings was a tall ash tree with a trunk at least 2 feet thick. Stig marched up to it. "Oh, no!" cried Barney. "Not that one, Stig!" But there was no stopping Stig. White chips flew as he swung again and again. There was soon a great wedge cut into the side of the tree, but it was still only halfway through. Stig stopped for a rest, and they both looked at the tree. It swayed a little. "You know what, Stig," said Barney. "It's going to fall and smash the fence if we're not careful. I'd better tie a rope to it." He slung the coil of rope round him and pulled himself up by the lower branches of the tree. As he climbed higher, he could feel something different about the swaying of this tree. It didn't have the springy, exciting sway of a sound tree, and at the end of each sway you had the feeling that it was waiting, not quite sure whether it would sway back again or whether it would just go on and fall. He tied the rope to the trunk as high up as he dared, threw the rope outwards and watched it uncoil to the ground and scramble down again. "Now we ought to saw it on the other side," said Barney. "I've seen Grandfather do it." He picked up the saw. "Here, you take the other end," he told Stig. Stig looked at the saw doubtfully. "Look," said Barney, "you hold that end and I hold this end. I pull and then you pull. It's easy once you get started." They scraped away clumsily until at last the saw teeth cut a straight groove and settled into it. Stig's eyes widened as the blade sang and the sawdust spurted out each end. Then the whole thing seemed to get sticky, and however hard they struggled, they couldn't move it either way. "Bother," said Barney. "We'll have to pull." With their third pull, as it rocked towards them, there came a cracking sound from the trunk. "It's coming!" cried Barney excitedly. The tree swayed away from them again, but they heaved again, and this time there were more splintering cracks. "Once more!" shouted Barney. From the trunk came a splitting, rending, screeching sound, and Stig and Barney turned and ran. Barney heard an appalling rush and crash and splintering of branches behind him as the crest hit the ground, and the topmost twigs thrashed the back of his legs as he ran. They turned round to look. Barney's heart was bouncing with excitement. "We've done it!" he gasped, gaping at the ruin they'd made, and the great empty hole they'd left in the skyline. What a lot of firewood! That afternoon, Barney brought a hatchet, iron wedges, and the big sledgehammer down to the copse. Stig and he trimmed off the smaller branches, cut up the boughs into long logs, and managed, after long and patient sawing, to cut the main trunk into 3. Then they set to work to split it up. The sky was now getting grey and dark, and an icy wind had begun to blow, but they didn't notice it. It warms you twice cutting wood. They trundled the logs to the edge of the pit and sent them crashing to the bottom.
"Come on, Stig, let's get the fire going," said Barney.
Stig picked up the gear lever of a motor car and poked carefully at the ashes of what had been the fire, but they were well and truly dead. Stig sighed. Then he reached for his bow, a fine steel bow made out of a springy television aerial and strung with picture wire. He took the leg of a hardwood chair, sharpened to a point at one end. He fitted the point into a hole in a block of wood which he held with his toes, passed the bowstring round the leg of the chair, held the top of the chair leg with a cracked egg cup, and began to draw the bow backwards and forwards so that the string made the chair leg twirl. Barney watched fascinated as the point of the chair leg twirling in the block of wood began to smoke. Stig quickly fed it with a handful of grass and started blowing on it, still fiddling away frantically with the bow. But everything in the cave was damp, and the little fire died out with a wisp of smoke. The bowstring snapped. Stig, exhausted, said something in his strange language, threw the chair leg across the cave, and sat there biting his nails.
"Do you want a light, Stig?"
asked Barney brightly. He took a box of matches from his pocket and struck one. The little flame lit up the cave. Stig leapt to his feet and stood staring at the lighted match with round eyes. When the flame burnt down to Barney's fingers and he had to blow it out, Stig gave a despairing moan.
"It's all right, Stig, I've got lots more,"
Barney said. He struck another, and Stig crept up to stare at it.
"Come on, let's have some paper and twigs," said Barney.
At last the flames licked upwards, and a warm glow began to light up the walls of the cave. Stig put 2 big logs at the back of the fire, and they began sizzling happily. Stig stretched himself out in the warmth like a cat, then held out his hand to Barney as if to ask for something. Barney handed him the matchbox. After 1 or 2 tries, Stig managed to strike the match. He held the little flame and gazed at it until he burnt his fingers and he had to drop it.
"Go on, strike another,"
urged Barney.
"Granny's got plenty. A box only costs a penny, I think."
But Stig wouldn't waste another. He took the box and hid it in his bed. It was clear he thought a match was a very precious thing indeed. Stig came back with his hands full of chestnuts. He put them in the ashes, and they lay and waited until the chestnuts popped. Then they hooked them out with the gear lever and blew on them and ate them. Barney felt wonderfully full and warm, and he lay looking at the fire and at the shadows dancing on the walls of the cave. But Stig was squatting with a faraway look in his eyes and a piece of charred board in his hand, looking towards a blank wall of the cave. He moved up to the wall, and suddenly he attacked it with his blackened stick. He made sweeping black lines, and there was the outline of a galloping horse, more fierce scrapes of the stick. There was a stag with antlers galloping. Soon there were little men running with spears and bows and arrows. Barney was hopping with excitement.
"Do some more, Stig. Oh, the men are killing the deer."
For there was a spear stuck in the shoulder of a galloping deer so that it hurt to look at it. Stig didn't seem to be aware of Barney, for Stig was out there with the hunt, galloping with the animals, running with the hunters. Barney went back to the fire to make it up, and caught a glimpse of the darkness outside the entrance. It was night, and he had to go back to the house through the dark, alone.
"Stig, I've got to go,"
he said. But Stig didn't hear. Barney looked at Stig's collection of weapons. There was a spear with a long shaft of smooth hazelwood and a head of gleaming flint. It quivered when he picked it up, as if it were alive.
"Stig, can I borrow one of your spears to see me home?"
Barney asked. Stig saw Barney with the spear and grinned. Barney took that as permission to have the spear. He took a piece of wood from the fire, one end of which was flaming brightly, and with the spear in the other hand, he crept out. It was pitch dark and very cold. An icy wind made the flame of his torch flicker.
As he made his way along the bottom of the pit, he kept his spear ready just in case. Perhaps the bears and things were asleep for the winter. Perhaps there weren't any bears. After all, this was nowadays, wasn't it? Or was it? It was difficult to feel sure in the dark at the bottom of the pit. As he went through the trees, a white thing swept towards him through the air. Without thinking, he jabbed at it wildly with his spear. But the owl, for that's what it was, swerved away sharply and ghosted off into the dark. "Off with you, Mr. Owl," said Barney crossly. "What do you mean by trying to frighten me?" By the time he reached the house, he was sorry to have to come in out of the dark. He put out the torch in the water butt, put the spear in the broom cupboard, and changed his shoes. His grandmother and sister were sitting at the table eating crumpets. "Barney, where have you been? Were you up in your room all this time?" "No, Granny, I've been out with Stig. Poor Stig was nearly frozen to death, and I had to warm him up, and his axe wasn't sharp enough to cut down the little trees, so we cut down a big one, and the saw got stuck, so I had to climb up it and pull it down, and then we cut it up and pushed it down the pit, and Stig tried to light the fire with a chair leg and an egg cup and a television aerial, but I showed him how to strike matches, and we ate chestnuts. And Lou, Stig's jolly good at drawing horses and things, and he was still drawing them when I left with a piece of black board on the chalk." Lou giggled. "Granny, Barney said Stig was drawing with a blackboard on the chalk. He meant a chalk on the blackboard." Barney decided to join in the laughter. They didn't ask him any more questions after that, but Barney felt happier about helping Stig with his firewood than he did about all the presents he'd got for Christmas. Lou had gone hunting. The North Kent foxhounds were meeting near Grandmother's house, and a neighbour had offered to take Lou along. Grandmother hadn't been sure, but Lou had gone clattering off in the rain on Flash, the old pony. Barney thought she looked a bit smug, but maybe it was just the rain trickling down her neck that made her nose turn up. Barney stood by the window looking at the weeping grey clouds. "I'll take you in the car if you like, Barney," said his grandmother. "We could follow along the lanes." "No," said Barney. "Thank you," he added. "You'd rather just amuse yourself, dear?" Barney nodded. He went to the broom cupboard and untangled Stig's spear from all the other handles. The flint blade glinted. He shook it. Lou wasn't the only one who could go hunting. Stig was in his den, sitting contentedly by a cheerful fire. He looked alarmed at first, not recognizing Barney in all his rain gear, but as soon as he saw Barney's face under the sou'wester, he grinned. "Hello, Stig," called Barney. "Would you like to come hunting? Foxes! Seek 'em out, Stig!" Barney made fierce stabbing motions with the spear, but Stig only looked puzzled. How was he to explain to Stig about the meat of the foxhounds, and how he wanted them to join in? He put down the spear and picked up a charred stick. "Look, Stig," he said. "Fox!" And he carefully did his best drawing of a fox on the wall of the cave. Barney went on drawing. "Hound, Stig," he said. Stig's eyes grew very big and round. "Crackers," thought Barney. "I'll have to draw the horses now." But he was rather pleased with his horse, and at last Stig seemed to understand. "I'll have to put someone riding the horse," thought Barney. "I'll do Lou." There was something about this human figure actually on top of the animal that really seemed to excite Stig. His eyes blazed, and he jumped up and seized his best bow and a handful of arrows. Without even thinking of putting on any extra clothes against the wintry weather, Stig danced out into the rain, and Barney with him. From deep in the distant woods came the toot of a hunting horn. Barney and Stig set out across country towards it. They came into a woodland of tall, sweet chestnut trees and oaks, and walked in silence down a woodland track which held great pools of rainwater. Stig splashed through them without seeming to care how muddy his legs were getting. Barney saw Stig fit an arrow and raise his bow. Across the track ahead strutted a proud cock pheasant, and before it knew what was happening, Stig's flint-tipped arrow struck. With a pounce, Stig picked up the body, pulled the arrow out, and stuck the pheasant behind him into his girdle.
The long brown feathers wagged as if he'd sprouted a tail as he walked on, but Barney wasn't at all happy about killing this pheasant. It was bound to be poaching, or the wrong time of year, or not sporting to shoot them. The tootling of the horn was getting nearer now, and there were crashings in thickets, and the voice of the huntsman encouraging the hounds. Barney ran and caught up with Stig. "It's the hunt," he said. "There must be foxes here somewhere. Keep a good lookout, and we might see one." Barney suddenly thought that perhaps the huntsmen would be angry if they found them in the middle of the wood, especially with a poached pheasant. There was a bank with a sort of little cave under the exposed roots of a beech tree, and Barney pulled Stig into this. They both sniffed. There was a strong and peculiar smell hanging about the place. They lay there and waited. Barney tried to crawl backwards as far down the hole in the bank as he could. "That's funny," he muttered. "Someone's put sticks here." In the mouth of what seemed to be a large rabbit burrow were fixed 3 stakes of hazelwood, so that no animal bigger than a mouse could possibly get in or out. To pass the time, Barney kicked and worried at the stakes until he got them loose, and then cleaned the mud and chalk off them. "Look, Stig," he said, "you could make arrows out of these, or perhaps they're a bit thick." But Stig wasn't listening. He was looking up the track at an animal the size of a small dog, with reddish fur, sharp ears, and very bright eyes, calmly walking towards them with its tongue hanging out. Barney's heart missed a beat. He got slowly to his feet, gripping his spear. "Fox!" he hissed, levelling his spear. "Stig!" he breathed. "Come on! Now's your chance!" But Stig didn't raise his bow. Instead, he took hold of the end of Barney's spear and held it so that he couldn't throw it. The fox strolled calmly up to their very feet, gave Stig a glance, and vanished down the hole. Barney nearly burst into tears of rage. "Stig, why did you let him go?" he stormed. "You're supposed to kill foxes. That's what hunting's for. That's why we came." But Stig grinned. He pointed down the hole, acted a little pantomime as if he was eating, and screwed up his face as if he was tasting a bad taste. He made it quite clear that Barney was mistaken in wanting to kill something you couldn't eat. The scufflings in the undergrowth seemed to be just the other side of a bramble patch on the edge of the track. "Quick, Stig, they're coming!" exclaimed Barney. "Get back into our hiding place!" And he pulled Stig back into the mouth of the earth. As he did so, a large foxhound came out onto the track and lolloped towards them on the scent of the fox. It saw Stig and bared its teeth and growled. Stig bared his teeth and growled. The hound took a step forward, making horrible noises in his throat. Stig took a step forward on his hands and knees, making horrible noises in his throat. With a lightning spring, he darted forward and bit the hound hard on the ear. It was too much. The poor animal wasn't afraid of sharp-toothed foxes or other animals that fought back, but Stig smelt like a man, and it had never heard of a man biting a dog. It made off yelping. Barney looked at Stig. "I think we'd better go home," he said. "We're supposed to be fox hunting, and what have you done? Killed a pheasant, helped a fox, and bitten a hound." But Stig wasn't listening. He was hearing the thud and squelch of heavy hooves moving through the woodland glades. The horses of the hunt followers were moving through the wood, and now at last Stig's face was alight with the excitement of the hunt. Without a sound or a look to Barney, he started flitting from thicket to thicket and tree trunk to tree trunk towards the sound of the horses, an arrow already strung in his bow and held with his left thumb. Barney followed, with a feeling that something had gone badly wrong with his hunting trip, and that something far worse was going to happen any moment. And the more he tried to keep up with Stig, the hotter and crosser he was getting. When he came to an open space at last and saw Stig and saw what he was doing, all he could do was cover his face with his hands and moan softly to himself, "Oh, no, 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 no." Standing in the track where the huntsman had left it to go into a thicket on foot was the huntsman's white horse. Hiding behind a mossy stump, his eyes blazing with excitement, his bow bent to the full, with an arrow pointing straight at the white horse, was Stig. Stig was really hunting now, and to him, horses were meat. Lou was on her pony at the edge of the wood. On one side, the black trunks of the trees dripped sadly, and the wind moaned in the branches. On the other side, low, ragged clouds swept over the bare stubble fields. Around her were various ladies, gentlemen, and children of the hunt on board or fidgety horses, waiting for something to come out of the wood. Lou's cheeks were glowing, and so was her nose. Her eyes were sparkling, her hair hung down in wet strips. "If only they'd let me go into the wood and poke around a bit, I'm sure I could find a fox," she thought. "There must be something going on in there." At that moment, there seemed to be a sort of commotion among the riders that had gone some way into the wood. Horses were backing, rearing, turning in spite of their riders, snorting and neighing, and into the thick of them plunged the huntsman's white horse, riderless, eyes rolling and nostrils wide with alarm, cannoning into horses and riders and sending them sprawling in puddles and mud. It was a stampede. As the huntsman's horse bolted through the middle of them all, the other horses whipped round and joined it in mad flight. Most of the riders were caught off balance. Some lost their hats, some lost their reins or stirrups, some lost their seats straight away and were left on the edge of the stubble. Some of them, who'd been round the corner of the wood, thought the fox had gone away and urged their horses after the rest of the field. All Lou could do was stay on top of Flash as best she could and join the stampede. So this was hunting, she thought, though thinking was difficult at full gallop in the middle of a lot of other excited animals. Yet even then she had a feeling that there was something queer. Had she imagined it, or had she seen, sticking into the saddle of the bolting horse, something that looked like an arrow? No. She must have imagined it. "Why don't you go out and get some fresh air, Barney dear?" asked Grandmother. Barney stood and looked out of the window. "Doesn't look very fresh to me," he grunted. A yellow fog hung over the trees outside. "Never mind, dear. It's better than stuffing indoors all day." "All right, Granny, I'll go out." He made for the chalk pit whistling. But as he came near the edge of the pit, he stopped whistling and stood still. There were voices coming from the bottom of the pit. He went cautiously to the edge and peeped over. Down there, among the tin cans and other rubbish, were 3 boys of about his own age, dressed in jerseys and trousers that were grubbier and more tattered than his own, and grey tennis shoes with holes in the toes. Barney recognized them. They were the Snargit boys, part of a large family that lived in an old house with tarred weatherboards and were always getting into trouble. At least, that was what the grown-ups said. But then, who didn't get into trouble? The Snargits seemed to be building some sort of shack for themselves out of dead branches and old sheets of corrugated iron. Barney crawled to a place where a twisted tree trunk grew from the very edge of the cliff, hid himself behind it, broke off a handy-sized clod of clay, and hurled it at the roof of the shack. It missed and landed almost noiselessly on a mossy log. Barney chose himself another clod and threw it. This time it struck the bottom of an upturned pail and exploded like a little bomb, scattering bits of clay over one of the Snargits. "Here! Who's chucking dirt?" cried the first Snargit suspiciously. "I never," said another Snargit. "Must have been him," he added, pointing to the third and youngest. "I never done nothing," protested the youngest Snargit. "Oh, you didn't you?" said the first. "Well, don't you do it again, that's all." At the top of the cliff, Barney chuckled to himself and broke off another clod.
This time the clod landed on the sheet of iron with a most satisfying clang. 3 snarget heads popped out at once like ferrets out of rabbit holes. "I told you someone was chucking dirt," said the first snarget. "And I told you it wasn't me," said the youngest. They looked round, scowling. "All right, it's no use hiding, we can see you," called the eldest snarget. Barney hugged himself. This was just bluff. They hadn't even looked in his direction. They were standing looking at the far end of the pit, with their backs to Barney. With great care, Barney broke off as big a clod as he could find and aimed it again at the roof of the shack. It hit and exploded with another loud clang, scattering pieces over all 3 snargets, who clutched at each other and then looked foolish at being taken by surprise. They whispered fiercely among themselves, pointing at places on the cliff edge. "Come from behind us, it did." "Nah, it's up there, he is. I saw him." They all pointed in different directions at the edge of the cliff. "It's no use you hiding yourself up there," called the eldest snarget. "We're coming up to get you." But this didn't worry Barney. By the time they got to the top, he could be well away. The snargets must have thought this too, because they didn't make a move. They retired inside their rickety shack instead. Barney scored another direct hit on it and a near miss. Then all 3 snargets came out and started walking towards the way out. The eldest called out over his shoulder in a casual voice, "Goodbye, Albert," and the other 2 repeated it. They must think he was someone called Albert. "We're going home now, Albert," called the eldest. "It's our dinner time. Just keep your hands off our shack, see? We got something in there that's valuable. We just dare you to meddle with it, that's all." The snargets walked off towards the way out of the pit, whistling loudly and banging tins with sticks. Barney waited until he could hear their feet on the lane dying away. He came out from behind his tree and went round the edge of the pit to the low side, and walked along the bottom to the shack the snargets had built. There didn't seem to be anything in it except a paper bag full of chestnut conkers. Perhaps they'd buried something. He dug around in the mossy floor and unearthed a very rusty tin box. He could just make out the letters. "Gold block," it said. It felt heavy. Ought he to open it or not? He decided there was no harm in just looking. The hinged lid was rusted to the bottom and wouldn't move. He banged at it with a stone. Out fell a rusty mass of screws, nuts, bolts, and curtain rings. Inside the lid of the box was more writing, which said that gold block was the finest pipe tobacco made from choice Virginia leaf. Barney threw the tin away in disgust, and a voice said, "All right, mister, come out. We got you covered." It was the snargets. They'd played a trick on him and crept back. He came out of the shack and faced the snargets. One had a broken-down old air gun, and the others were pointing sticks. "Cool, it ain't Albert," exclaimed the youngest. "We can see that," said the oldest roughly. "What's your name?" he said to Barney. "Barney," said Barney. "What's yours?" "I'm the Lone Ranger, and he's Robin Hood and he's William Tell," snapped the eldest snarget. "What do you mean by chucking dirt at us?" asked the second snarget. "Yeah, and what you doing in our dump anyway?" piped the youngest fiercely. "Can if I want to," replied Barney, pretending not to mind, but he was not sure just how rough these snargets could get. "Can if he wants to, he says," exclaimed the Lone Ranger as if he couldn't believe his ears. "What shall we do with him, fellas?" "Tie him to a tree and shoot him full of arrows," suggested Robin Hood. "Put him in a dungeon and leave him to rot," said William Tell. "No, I reckon we ought to lynch him on the spot, string him up," said the Lone Ranger. "We ain't got no rope," said Robin Hood. "Well, we ain't got no bows and arrows," pointed out William Tell. "Well, there certainly ain't no dungeon for miles around," said the Lone Ranger. "Let's just give him a bit of slow torture." "I'd tell a policeman," said Barney stoutly. The eldest snarget looked carefully around the pit. "Can't see no policeman here," he said scornfully.
I'd tell my granny, and she lives just up there," said Barney. The Snargits collapsed in howls of laughter. Barney felt his face going red and tears coming into his eyes. Then he thought of something. "I'm going to tell Stig," he said calmly. The laughter gradually died down. "Who's Stig?" the eldest Snargit asked suspiciously. "Oh, a friend of mine," replied Barney airily. "Where does he live?" squeaked the smallest Snargit. "Here," said Barney. "Here?" chorused the Snargits scornfully. "What, in the dump?" "Yes," said Barney. "Didn't you know?" "What's he do? Tell us that then." "He makes bows out of television aerials and arrows out of bits of flint," replied Barney. The Snargits gaped at him with open mouths. "Look here," said the eldest at last. "This here Stig of yourn, what is he then, a boy or a man?" "He's a caveman," Barney said. At once the Snargits burst into jeers and laughter again. "Come on, fellas, let's do him." But Barney set off at a run towards the other end of the pit. The Snargits were after him with shrill cries. Barney knew the bottom of the pit better than the Snargits, and he seemed to be leaving them behind. As quietly as he could, so that his pursuers couldn't hear him through the nettle banks and elder trees, he made for the entrance to Stig's den, flung himself through the low doorway, and collapsed, puffing, blowing, unpleased with himself, on the floor of the cave. Stig was there, busy making himself a really horrible-looking club out of a tree root into which he was fixing bits of flint, broken glass, and rusty nails. "Oh, hello, Stig," panted Barney. "I'm jolly glad to see you." But when he saw the horrible club, he began to feel he couldn't set this monster onto three little boys who hadn't really done anything to him yet. It may have only been a game after all. Barney smiled uncertainly at Stig, and Stig returned him a friendly grin. Then from outside came the sound of the Snargits calling to each other. There were the sounds of the undergrowth being beaten and stones being flung into bramble patches. Stig looked at Barney, but Barney made signs to be quiet. Footsteps crackling on dry twigs sounded quite close to the den. Suddenly, the voice of the youngest Snargit piped up excitedly. "There's an hole here, an hole! Come out of it!" And a large lump of chalk came flying in through the entrance and hit Stig on the side of the head. Stig gave one roar and charged out of his doorway. Barney threw himself after him to see what would happen. The youngest Snargit gave one pop-eyed, disbelieving look and turned and fled, sobbing and screaming. "It's a caveman!" The other Snargits saw Stig and turned and ran too. "Wait for me! Wait for me! Wait! Don't leave me!" wailed the youngest, and then uttered a shrill scream of terror as he put his foot through the bottom of a rusty enamelled basin and fell headlong. "Help! Help! 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 He's got me! He's got me! He's got me!" Almost as alarmed as the young Snargit, Barney ran up to where Stig was standing over the boy, who was shivering and moaning with fright. But Stig was looking down at the fallen William Tell Snargit with an almost fatherly look in his eyes. He bent down to help the boy to his feet, and the Snargit moaned feebly, "Don't, don't." Then seeing Barney approaching, he wailed, "Don't let him hurt me, I won't do no harm." But Stig kept hold of him and led him firmly but gently towards his den. The Snargit gang, troublemakers though they were not the men to abandon one of their number to his fate. Stig, Barney, and their captive hadn't been long inside the den before there came the sound of hesitant footsteps from nearby. Barney looked out, and there were the two other Snargits, standing meekly together, unarmed, and holding paper packets in their hands. The middle brother had a handkerchief, which might have been supposed to be white, tied to a stick. "We got gifts," said the one with the white flag. "Yeah," said the other. "We came for the little one." Barney hesitated. "You'd better come in," he said. but no tricks.
They came in through the doorway, saw Stig for the first time close to, and stopped, their eyes growing rounder. Then the second of them took a step forward gingerly, holding out his hand with a paper bag on it.
"For you,"
he said in a shaky voice.
"It's jelly babies."
Stig took the little bag in a puzzled manner, squeezed it, smelt it, turned it about in his hairy hands. One jelly baby fell out onto the floor. Stig stooped to pick it up and held it to the light of the lamp with a pleased expression on his face. Then he reverently stood the little sweetmeat in a niche in the chalk and stood and looked at it.
"You're supposed to eat it, Stig," said Barney.
He went across to the jelly baby's little niche and popped it into his own mouth. Stig looked horrified, and Barney was afraid for a moment he was going to hit him.
"There's more in the bag, Stig," he said hurriedly,
and he took the bag from Stig and opened it and showed him the other little jelly figures.
"Go on, eat one."
Stig took one and put it slowly in his mouth and chewed. Barney and the Snargits watched anxiously. Then a smile slowly began to spread over Stig's face. The Snargits sighed with relief and smiled too. Everyone felt as though some very solemn ceremony had been performed. Barney handed round the bag, and all 5 of them solemnly ate jelly babies. Then the middle Snargit produced his second gift, which was little bags of fizzy sherbet with hollow sticks of licorice stuck in them to suck it through. They sat down to this. After a little instruction, Stig got the idea of how to suck the fizzy powder up through the little tube, but as soon as he got a mouthful and felt the unusual sensation on his tongue, he jumped up with an alarmed expression on his face and began coughing and spluttering, and the Snargits weren't sure whether to laugh or be alarmed too. But Barney banged Stig on the back, which impressed the Snargits even more, and managed to soothe him down again. Finally, with a flourish, the eldest Snargit produced a packet of Woodbine cigarettes and handed them round. It was Barney's turn to hesitate. As if he wished to show they were all friends now, Stig took one, beaming, and put it in his mouth, and before they could do anything, Stig had chewed up the little tube of tobacco and swallowed it with great satisfaction. The Snargits and Barney lit their cigarettes at the lamp. Barney immediately choked on his and threw it away. The smallest Snargit puffed away and turned first white and then green. The other 2 smoked away quite happily. But Stig, though he ate another one, couldn't be persuaded to send up in smoke what he considered to be nourishing food. The Snargits began to feel at home. "He's all right, your pal Stig," said the eldest Snargit. "Don't say much, though, do he? Don't he speak English?" "I wasn't really feared of him," piped up the youngest. "I was just making out, I was." "Yeah, no, we wasn't really going to do no harm to old Barney here, was we, fellas? It were all just make-believe, wasn't it? Reckon old Barney and his pal Stig are all right, eh, fellas?" The others agreed in chorus. Barney felt a warm feeling inside, now that the Snargits reckoned he and his friend Stig were all right. "I'll tell you what," went on the eldest Snargit. "Stig and Barney will be part of our gang from now on, and we'll swear an oath we won't none of us tell no one about this here den." Barney was going to agree, and then he thought, well, it was his secret first anyway, so why should he swear about it with anybody? But the Snargits swore a horrible oath among themselves over the body of the last jelly baby in the bag, which they then cut the head off and buried to show what would happen to any of them who broke their oath. Barney felt fairly sure that his secret wouldn't spread around the village now. "Did you find something to do, dear?" asked his grandmother at lunchtime. "I had super fun with the Snargits, Granny. First I bombed them, and then they were going to torture me, but I got away to Stig's den, and they thought Stig was going to eat one of them, but we ate babies instead, you know, jelly ones." "Oh," said Granny, "aren't the Snargits rather rough boys for you to play with?" "Yes, but they're not nearly as rough as Stig." "I reckon they're all right," said Barney. End of side 2.